Hello and welcome. My name is Victoria Keane and I'm from the Homes England Local Government Capacity Centre. I'm delighted to welcome you to this summer learning programme session. The summer learning programme offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics that you've told us that you're interested in. And today's event is called Myth Busting Build to Rent. This summer learning programme is brought to you by the Homes England Local Government Capacity Centre, and this slide summarises who we are and what we do. We've launched the centre following extensive research and consultation with you across local government and with a whole range of other partners to determine where authorities most need support and how this can be best delivered. We look forward to hearing how we did in the survey poll at the end of the session, and this will help us design future sessions. Okay, next slide, please. So on the screen now, you've got a breakdown of what we're going to learn about today. I'm giving you your welcome, and then we're going to hear from Homes England's Jennifer Murray for the Homes England context. Then we're going to hear from James Pargeter and David Woodward about the myth-busting build to rent with an introduction, context, the story so far, and including some case studies. Then at the end, we're going to have time for Q&A. So please do put your questions in the chat, and then we'll get some final thoughts and some feedback from you. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Jennifer Murray. Thank you.
Good morning. As Vicky says, I'm Jennifer Murray, and my role at Homes England is to work with institutional capital to unlock more investment in housing, specifically from the country's pension funds and insurers. But I think I'm here for a slightly more personal reason. And I'm really delighted that Vicky's team wanted to run this session as part of our summer learning programme. And that's because I guess I had a bit of an epiphany about renting in the UK. And it's one that has led me to really strongly believe that regardless of tenure that a person chooses to occupy their home in, they should have the best experience possible. And that means a decent home, a choice about how long they live there, a responsive maintenance, and a proactive landlord. Now, I appreciate that that is not a controversial or even an original set of beliefs, but truthfully, too many rented homes in the UK just don't meet these criteria. And it's different elsewhere, and there's a reason why. And I came to this from living in the US in my early 20s. At the time, everyone back home was living in probably at best something out of the young ones, or at worst, renting a room from Rigsby and Rising Damp. And I make no apologies here. If you're under 45, you'll probably have to Google those references. But the scene wasn't great. And the experience of being a renter in the US seemed to be a bit different. And what I realized is that I was living in Atlanta, and people in their early 20s were starting out in life, were living in homes that were quite nice, quite good quality, quite sort of acceptable. And I didn't think too hard about it then. But roll forward a few years, and I appreciated that part of the reason for this is that these homes were owned by long-term professional committed landlords, and predominantly the pension funds and insurers of North America. And I think there's a really nice circularity here in that those pensioners and policyholders are in some ways supporting the homes of a younger generation. So I think it's a very, very virtuous circle with regard to institutional ownership of homes. Now, in the States, it's known as multifamily or single family housing. In this country, it's called build to rent. So what do we actually mean by build to rent? Well, we mean purpose-built homes owned and professionally managed by institutional landlords. It's a sector that's grown really significantly in the last 10 years. But it's one that I guess, as I'm really pleased this poll has flagged, a lot of people don't know so much about. So that's why I'm really delighted that we've got David and James with us today to talk more about it and for us to discuss it. So we want to talk about some of the preconceptions that there are, what these homes actually are and what they look like, how it offers choice, really importantly, how it offers choice for renters. And from a Homes England and housing delivery perspective, is how we can accelerate a sense of community and the delivery of new homes. Before I hand over to them, sorry, I should really say James and David have got some of the longest experience in the UK in terms of owning and advising on how to manage home for rents as developers and operators. But just before I hand over to them, a little bit of context, if we flip forward to the next slide, on Homes England's activity in this area. Back in 2012, we were one of the earliest movers, I think, in terms of supporting the emergence of the sector. We had ultimately £1 billion build to rent fund, which was providing debt to build to rent developers at a time when the clearing banks just weren't. And think about it in the context of coming out of the financial crisis and a new and emerging sector, a new and emerging development partners. So we were stepping in to provide debt for some of the earliest schemes that were being built. I'm really pleased to see that these are now built and occupied, and we can go and look at them. And that delivered around about 7,000 new homes. As the market started to become a little more established, we moved on from a sort of pure lending arrangement to providing a build to rent guarantee scheme. Again, really supporting debt, but with maybe some more challenging schemes or less mature developers. From my perspective, as someone from a sort of investing for institutions perspective, I'm delighted that our first equity investment in 2017 was supporting the raise of the first ever investment fund that's invested in family homes for rent, and that was the PRS REIT, so Private Rented Sector REIT. And today we still continue to sell our land for BTR development, and we provide debt to developers where the market still won't. So with that, I'd like to introduce David Woodward and James Pargeter of Global Apartment Advisors, who will lead us through today's discussion.
Well, thanks very much, Jennifer. That's a really nice introduction, and thank you to Homes England for having us here today to be part of your programme. My name's James Pargeter. I've been involved in build to rent for over 10 years now. When I was at Deloitte leading a residential projects team at the time. I've subsequently spent 5 years or so at Greystar with some of their initial projects in the UK, and now I'm a senior advisor at Global Apartment Advisors, or GAA. I'm looking forward to this.
And good morning, everyone. I'm David Woodward. I'm the CEO of GAA. As you can hear from my accent, I'm from the States, where, as Jennifer said, multifamily, as it's called there, has been around as an institutional sector for several decades now. But I've been in the business both in the US and now here in the UK for 25 plus years. So looking forward to presenting to everyone today.
Great. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is a poll. So apart from your own individual knowledge of build to rent, do you have a view on your organisation's attitude towards build to rent? Because this will be an interesting starting point for our discussions. So if you can cast your votes now, and I'll probably keep talking. If we can also go to the next slide when we can. I think the objectives today are really to provide a bit of education about what build to rent is, and probably focusing not so much, although we'll be touching on the sort of how, what, and where questions around build to rent. I think we really want to be focusing on the why build to rent. You know, why is this an important thing? Why are we so committed to it? And you know, having been involved in residential development for you know, probably the same length of time as David, overall about 25 years in terms of delivery across all tenures. Why do we feel that build to rent really is something that really needs further attention beyond what you might feel it's had already? And that brings benefits primarily to the renters themselves, and it really allows us to collaborate with other parties a lot more quickly, building more homes, which, as we all know, we really need. Okay, maybe we can have the next slide when you're ready, please. Thanks. So our objectives here are to bust some myths, as the title, to demonstrate how build to rent can help the housing crisis, and to advocate for more build to rent provision within the housing spectrum. And that word spectrum is really key here, because we're not actually arguing against other housing tenures. They're all needed. We're pro housing as an overall sector, and we need need more homes of all types to be provided for people in various circumstances in various places.
I think that, James, that's an interesting point, in that we sometimes get asked, don't people ultimately want to own? And the answer is probably, but not always, and perhaps at a later point in their life. So I think an important takeaway from today is that build to rent is not intended to replace ownership. It's just another tenure that's available. And while people are renters, the goal is to make it, as Jennifer said, to make it as good of an experience as it can be.
Yeah, so that's great. So we've, the build to rent sector in the UK is probably about 10 years old, approximately, and a lot of that, it was built on assumptions that were reasonably speculative. But that time has passed. We've got a lot of evidence, which we'll show some of it to you today, and it's really time for even more action. So if we can have the next slide, please. Common myths about build to rent. We'll touch on some of these in a bit more detail later on once we've illustrated some context. But I think there are, over the last 10 years, when we've been trying to get this sector going and talking to local authorities and other stakeholders around the country, trying to get planning and development going, we come across a lot of myths about build to rent, and a lot of assumptions which are quite understandable in many senses because of the legacy of the private rented sector more widely. But they're around affordability, lifestyle, affordable housing, amenities, and those sort of things. And you can see some of the comments there, which are typical, and we'll address some of those more directly in a moment. Okay, next slide, please. I think before looking at the detail, I think it's worth reflecting on the reasons people do rent, why they either need or even want to rent. And I think that wanting to rent is becoming increasingly important, because I think the assumption has always been it's just about affordability, and if you can afford to buy, that's what you will do, regardless of anything else. And I think it's a lot more nuanced and complex than that, particularly in a world where people's circumstances, particularly their employment, and we've seen this over the last 2 years, particularly in terms of the pandemic, is probably a little bit more flexible than it was before, but also a little less certain in terms of its future visibility. And I think there's very few people probably out there who feel more secure in their circumstances than they did a couple of years ago. If you're in that category, congratulations, but I think you're probably in the minority. But I think that there are issues around there about people's personal flexibility, whether that's in terms of employment type or personal circumstances, convenience, but what people want to be better, particularly with reference to sort of the typical rental experience or the average rental experience, is that reliability, particularly around peace of mind and security of tenure, but also in terms of responsive management.
Yeah, James, I would just add that from a US perspective, where again the sector has been around for several decades now, there was a point in time historically where renting was looked down upon a bit. There was a bit of a stigma. You're a renter. Why aren't you an owner? And I know that exists here in the UK as well. But I guess the point to make is, in the US, that's no longer really the case. There's lots of examples where people are renting. In fact, they call them renters by choice. People who otherwise could certainly afford to buy and own, but for various reasons on the slide here, they're choosing to rent. And so perhaps that same kind of progression will happen here in the UK over time.
That's great. Okay, the next slide, please. So the next section, we're going to talk about the context for the growth, or for the emergence of build to rent in the UK. And if we can go to the next slide as well, we'll see that the problems with the private rented sector have been long-standing in terms of road landlords, and people have rightly focused on the poor quality at the bottom end of that market, either in terms of bad quality accommodation or bad quality behaviour from individual landlords in the main. And those are just a selection of some of the organisations who've been campaigning quite rightly against those sort of conditions. If we can have the next slide, please. So it was really good to see, I think about 3 weeks ago now, that the fairer private rented sector white paper came out from government. Fairly long awaited, but there have been other things going on. But this really highlighted some of the problems in the private rented sector that have been historic, and really setting out a path for improvements to the rights and conditions for those renters. And if you look at some of the issues there in terms of the unfit homes, a transparency about rental increases, end of section 21 no fault evictions. I think all of those things are things where you could say imitation is the best form of flattery, because Build to Rent really has set out with those principles at least 10 years ago in this country, and it's really that sort of best practice ethos and approach to renting that has driven both developers, landlords, and operators in this sector.
Yeah, James, I was just going to add that when I first started doing work in the UK 7 or 8 years ago, I would regularly get asked, "Will Build to Rent work here?" Because again, it's well established in the US. And my response back then was, "Well, we have a housing shortage. We have a lot of renters. We need more supply to go into the market, and everyone generally likes nice accommodation and good service. So I think it will work." And lo and behold, 8 years later, it's still been a long journey, and it's been relatively slow to take hold, but it does seem to be working.
Great. So next slide, please. So there's some just graphical representations of the housing tenure evolution over the last, if you look at the left-hand graph, over the last century, really, when getting on towards 80% of people did rent in this country in that area. It's gone through a lot of decline alongside a rise in owner occupation and affordable housing, and for various reasons in the last 20, 30 years. Owner occupation seems to have peaked now and is slightly coming down. Affordable housing is probably fairly static, and the one thing that's rising at the moment is private renting.
I think the interesting thing on this slide, the one on the left, you can see that owner occupied is slowly coming down a bit, and private renting is coming up. But the overall percentages in the UK vary roughly kind of 2/3 owners and 1/3 renters. That's almost identical to the US in those percentages. And my earlier point that you can have a very healthy ownership rate and owner occupiers, but also a very healthy rental market as well.
Okay, next slide, please. So here's some graphics from the English Private Landlords Survey, which show the proportions of landlord types, and the overwhelming majority, 94% are just private individuals, most of whom have 1 or 2 properties. So it's a very fragmented market, and it's driven by individual decisions about investment for pension or capital growth of those homes, and very little in terms of providing a good service to their tenants or customers. Next slide, please. And I think this is a really interesting analysis from Capital Economics recently, which showed that if you take the 300,000 a year homes target for England, put it up to about 340 for the whole of the UK, as they've done here, then really what is required in the shortfall is between about 100 and 200,000 a year if you take homes for sale and homes for affordable housing to continue being delivered at the average rate they have done for the last decade. That's a huge hole to be filled if those numbers are to be achieved. And I think that range of 100 to 200,000 is something we need to keep in mind for when we look at what the sector has been delivering to date beyond that. So
yeah, I think, James, just the sheer number there of what we would need in terms of new homes and new rental homes as well. We'll show you here shortly what's actually been delivered. So I think one of the myths, perhaps, if anyone in the session is thinking build to rent is taking over the country, or you see build to rent developments going on everywhere you look, on a relative basis, it really is a kind of a small percentage of the overall stock that's being built.
Okay, next slide, please. Thank you very much. We have another poll. So these are really interesting for us, and hopefully they are for you. But if private rents are rising in your area, can you give an indication of what you think the main factor for that is? Whether they're not rising at all, whether they're to do with landlord decisions or available rental stock or other reasons, as you can see there. And I think if we can go on to the next slide while people are voting on that, that'd be useful. And I think this is a really fascinating chart that came out fairly recently, but that shows that there's a lack of rental stock available to rent, 39% lower than the previous period, and what's happening to rents rising as a result of that. And you can see that from the position of the axes on this chart, it should be a sort of 4-quadrant chart, but every single part of the country is showing results in the same quadrant, which is why the axes are skewed, i.e. there is less available stock to rent for people who are in the market to rent, and as a result, simple supply and demand really unsurprisingly showing that the pressure on those rents is rising, and that's across all major cities, all other parts of the country, which is I think a really telling chart.
Yeah, and of the poll results coming in so far, about half are answering lack of available rental stock.
Yeah.
And not to skew your answer, but I think that's our opinion as well, is much of what you're hopefully hearing today is that we have a bit of a supply issue. Will not solve all problems, but additional supply will help solve some of the problems that we're having.
Yeah, and of course, part of that problem with the lack of stock is individual landlords choosing to get out of the market. You'll see some of the comments on the right-hand side of that slide showing that there has been a reduction, and many landlords are choosing to come out for a variety of reasons, which we could go into in Q&A if you'd like to. I think if we go on to the next slide, though, please. You can see that overall, that is, according to Home Track, this is the latest snapshot of the rental market across the country, and you can see it's not just the big cities where this is happening. This is pretty much across the board. You're getting rises of between kind of 8 and 15% across the country, which, in view of the current inflation rate, may not seem too bad, but a few months ago it did look quite steep. But that's a widespread problem that needs a widespread answer. Next slide, please. So the impact on generation rent is obviously very severe. This was, if you've got a chance to go back and have a look at this article, it's a really good one by a junior reporter at the Sunday Times back in February, just in despair about trying to find somewhere to live. Her friends having similar problems, and if you look at some of the comments and conclusions that she came to, you look at some of those and you think, well, staying with wealthy friends is not a serious answer to a housing crisis when you look at on a macro level, and so we've got to do better than that between us all. And if we go on to the next slide, see some of the comments in response to the white paper of 3 weeks ago. BBC Radio 5 had a phone in that morning, which was pretty moving actually in some cases. People who are coming in with tales of being evicted from their flats because the landlord is wanting to sell up, including a guy who'd been there with his disabled wife for over 35 years, and it was now being told at a month or two's notice to get out, and it was just really desperate for people to not have that sort of security of how they could see the future. And the chart on the right there just shows the number of shows that private landlords are leaving the market, and again, that's a common thread across the whole country. Every region is suffering the same impact.
Yeah, I would say, just anecdotally, when I first moved here 5 years ago, I seemed to hear much more often about people who owned a couple of rental flats, kind of as part of their pension plan, if you will. And I just don't hear that as much anymore. I hear people complaining about being a private landlord and the hassle factor or whatnot. Obviously, there's been some tax changes as well. So it doesn't because obviously I spend a lot of time talking about property and real estate, and I don't hear the same types of conversations. So, but I guess a myth to bust perhaps is that build to rent is driving private landlords out of the rental market. I don't personally believe that at all. I think they're leaving the rental market for other reasons. Tax changes, hassle factor, maybe the returns on their investment aren't as good as they would have thought they would be. So again, back to really needing more supply at the end of the day. And the other thing I guess to say, James, is the certainty of tenure issue, which again, as an American living here, this idea that people are asking for their flats back, either because they're moving back in, or they want to sell their flat, or they've got a relative that's moving into town, or what have you. And I think we all have had experiences, either personally or we know people firsthand that have had to move 2 or 3 or more times when they didn't really want to. And if you think of the cost, of having to pick up and move and find a new place to live, and the hassle, and if kids' schools are a consideration, it's a huge disruption, which frankly build to rent solves for, because build to rent is meant to be rental forever, long-term tenure. As long as people want to stay, they can. It really completely solves that one particular problem.
That's great. I do agree with all of that. I think one of the reasons that individual landlords are starting to leave the market is actually upgrading from an environmental perspective. Many older properties are going to take a lot of capital in order to upgrade, and probably people are getting out. That may be good news for home buyers, actually, in terms of the second-hand buyer market, but it doesn't do anything. In fact, it has a negative impact, obviously, on rental stock. So if we have the next slide, please. Which I think is another poll. We're not going to have them quite as frequent for the rest of this, you'll be glad to hear, but this would be really interesting, because I think pretty much everyone has probably rented a property in the past, and they may well still be doing that now. And so I think if you've had to leave a rental property against your own choice, what was the primary reason for that? And if we can have people voting while we move on to the next slide, please. We'll finally come to the actually talking about build to rent, as we've had the context of how this sector came about, because actually a lot of people in this build to rent sector recognized the problems in the UK rental sector historically, and really wanted to do something about it. And I think
James, I'll just jumping in. I'm watching the poll numbers here jump around.
Right. Yes.
And 2/3 of you, almost exactly, have said it hasn't happened to you personally. But the next highest result is 13% saying the landlord selling the property. So the example that I just gave.
Yeah.
And then another high response rate was the quality of the accommodation, which again, build to rent attempts to solve for. Better quality accommodation, more responsiveness to maintenance issues, et cetera.
Yeah. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So the role of the build to rent, and this is a graphic I sort of devised when I was first starting to think about it. And what are the two principal factors of your experience in rental homes, or rental housing? It's firstly your accommodation quality, the quality of the actual building and its surroundings, but also the quality of the experience you get primarily from your landlord in terms of being a reasonable person and organising maintenance when required. And of course, that whole private rented sector, accommodates good and bad on both of those scales. And right at the bottom left-hand corner, obviously, are the rogue landlords and the accommodation we all like to see the back of. But if you start to put minimum standards on those two primary things, you get to a professionally managed sector, which including student housing. And if you say, well, it's going to be actually purpose designed and built and then managed, you're really up in the top right-hand corner, and that's really what we mean by build to rent. So it is definitely a subset of the private rented sector, but it's it's purposeful, it's intentional, and it's deliberately long-term. And the benefits for residents are not only the physical attributes, but also those emotional benefits in terms of peace of mind, feeling like you're in a proper home, and that can then building that sort of community brings broader local benefits as well.
Yeah, just not so much myth busting, but just maybe educating on terminology, because the market tends to use BTR and PRS a little bit interchangeably. Our view is that BTR is, as James is showing on this slide, a subsection of the overall PRS market. PRS being all private rented units, and BTR being the purpose designed, purpose built, usually institutionally owned by an insurance company or a pension fund, and professionally managed.
Yeah, great. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So yes, hopefully people are familiar with this, but in the National Planning Policy Framework, build to rent is specifically defined. And actually the term really came about as a term to put into planning policy in order to differentiate it with other housing types as being something that's deliberately designed and built for rent. And it also talks about affordable housing for within that context as a sort of an affordable private rent intermediate housing product. And we will talk about that a bit later in a bit more detail. But if we can move on for now, I think these figures are really stunning. So we have the 4.4 million private rental households in the as they relate to the relative sizes of both social rent, affordable housing, and owner occupation. And you can see the relative sizes of those three primary tenure categories. What I find really interesting is, and it relates to the last poll, is the relative size of the amount of movement. This is obviously on an annual basis of 600,000 people moving within that private rented sector each year, and nearly 200,000 more joining it each year. Those are pretty large numbers, particularly when you look at the relative moves within the other sectors. In owner occupation, much larger segment of the housing spectrum, but much less movement within it. And there's a whole range of reasons for that, and I think that is one of those was it's obviously personal flexibility and change of location and going to a new job in a new city, that sort of thing. But also there's that getting out of somewhere because landlords ask you to.
Well, James, I was just going to interrupt you and say, sorry, that list on the right, down the right side of this slide, again, BTR solves for some of these issues, hopefully. If you needed a change in home size, and we've seen this in practice within a BTR context, people can move from a 1-bedroom to a 2-bedroom or vice versa and stay at the same property. The security of tenure or inability to renew, I already addressed that prior. Negative landlord relationship, hopefully that's not the case, because the BTR operator, their sole job is to provide good service to the customer, because if they don't, the customer is going to pick up and go somewhere else. So they are highly motivated to keep people happy and provide a high level of service. Changing household composition, again, that kind of gets addressed by bigger apartments, smaller apartments. So that maybe doesn't solve for everything, but I think it does solve for a lot of the challenges on this list.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. These are some of the major motivations for creating a purpose-built, purpose-managed sector. So let's move on to the next slide, please, and we start to look at the actual statistics, which are regularly published every quarter from British Property Federation in association with Savills and Mollior, and we can see that to date, and that's probably over the last 10 years or so, a total of nearly 73,000 build-to-rent homes have been completed and are available for occupation now. That's notionally a relatively big increase on a year ago, so that's good news. And in total, when you look at if you add in the schemes that are either under construction or in planning, we get up to a grand total of about 225,000. Now, if you bear in mind the figure we looked at on the previous chart a little while ago, that actually we need sort of between 100 and 200,000 additional homes annually to cope with the housing crisis, then bear in mind these numbers are over a 10-year period, and therefore we're still a long way from filling that gap.
Well, the other thing to say, the 72,000 units that have been completed, as James said, that's 10 years of the build-to-rent sector, slowly gaining traction. The 225,000 units you see circled there at the bottom, that includes under construction and in planning. So many of these units won't deliver for several years yet to come. So again, just to contrast, 100 to 200,000 units needed per year, and this is 10 years of work. So back to my earlier point, it's a bit of a drop in the bucket as to what we really need to help provide some relief to the housing shortage.
And it's good that it's growing. I mean, it's come from a standing start almost, but we are still in a relatively sort of infant or toddler stage of the sector's development. So we can have the next slide, please. If you look at those cumulative completions over the last few years, at least, you can see that initially a lot of the investment and the development was in London, which are in the blue bars there. But actually, over the last few years, regions outside London have grown faster and have overtaken London's production, and that seems to be a trend which is going to continue, which is a good thing, because as we've already seen, this is a nationwide problem, not confined just merely to large cities. And if we look at the next,
yeah, James, sorry, that might be a bit of a myth to bust, perhaps, is that build-to-rent is only an urban, bigger city phenomenon, and we're working on schemes with clients in lots of secondary towns, smaller towns, towns that frankly don't have much in the way of rental stock, where it's very informal. We're actually leasing up a property as we speak in Farnham, which really doesn't have an organized rental market, but the response that we've received with, again, brand new product, designed properly, professionally managed, has been overwhelming, because people generally can't find anything like it. And so don't rule out an area for being a candidate for build to rent just because it's a smaller population base.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that diversification of product is something we're going to touch on a bit later as well, which is a really good development over recent times. The next slide, please, just to reinforce. This shows again, the London's in the blue, regions are in the orange line. The construction starts of build-to-rent homes across the UK. I think that's generally that's very positive. I think particularly in regional growth over the last couple of years, clearly probably some of that's impacted by the pandemic. I'm just trying to find no, probably it hasn't actually, because it's come up, which is good. The construction sector's kept going. The slightly worrying thing is that in the last quarter or so, it's slightly dipped, so we need to keep an eye on that. But if we go on to the next slide as well, this is again from the BPF's website, and it's a really interesting one to sort of go into in a bit more detail for your part of the world. But it shows that these are the build-to-rent schemes across the country, and clearly there are many in the large cities, but there are a lot now in smaller cities and towns across the country, still with some significant actual gaps, and which is worrying, because we've seen this is a nationwide problem. There are some places which are not really embracing this yet, and it would be good to understand some of the reasons behind that. But I'd recommend you go and have a look at that map, because it's very widespread. If we go on to the next slide, please. And I think one of the most recent sort of things that's coming to coming to the fore now is this issue about diversification. It's not just about big shiny apartment blocks in city centres. It's the product range within build to rent and purpose-built rental is becoming a lot more diverse. And the major other categories, suburban build to rent, often single family housing, as it's called, where the homes are usually houses rather than flats. And although that's got some catching up to do to get to the level of urban build to rent over the last 10 years, that has definitely started and is growing pretty fast. And there's a lot of advantages to that, which we can talk about a bit later as well. Next slide, please. So despite this growth, I think it's that's all pretty healthy, but it's good to keep the perspective in mind, the context that despite all of that growth over the last 10 years, completed stock accounts for still less than 1.5% of all rental households. And even if you put in the pipeline of under construction and in planning, you're only just getting over 2%. Now, in terms of international comparisons, that is still incredibly small. And I think David's got a point on that. So
I was going to say, in a US context, you'd see kind of 20 to 30% of the stock would be in a what we call multifamily in a built to rent type format. So we have a long way to go to get anywhere close to that level.
Yeah, so that's good. So we're still not really catering for demand yet. But if we look at the next slide and take those numbers, the yellow square is what's been completed to date. The purple square is what's coming in the pipeline. But actually, if you look at that, sort of around a third of all rental homes, and that there are about 4.4 million at the moment, that could rise to 4.5, say, approximately 1.5 million rental homes are required in terms of deliberately designed and built to rent homes, if we're to get to that sort of benchmark of a third of homes. And I think there's I won't go through all here, but there's a range of key factors in how to get there, and why build to rent growth is a sort of a healthy thing. Both to invest in, but also to manage and to include within the community and the housing spectrum within that community. So next slide, please. So that's reflected in, on the left-hand side there, sort of levels of investment into build-to-rent sector, which again have been growing. I think when we started this 10 years ago, there was a bit of a challenge to get investment into the sector. People didn't really understand it. That problem has been largely overcome, and there's lots of patient institutional capital waiting to come in to help develop this product. But it's also important to realize that the valuation approach to build to rent is different from build to sale, very, very different. And some policy documents refer to that distinct economics of build to rent, where it's far more akin to a sort of a commercial building where the value is generated from the rent generated, not from the bricks and mortar in isolation, which it has been if you look at individual properties. And so that's an important thing to bear in mind when we start to consider things like viability assessments and Section 106 obligations. They are different. It can still meet a lot of obligations. I'm not saying it can't, but the approach to that is different, and that does need to be.
James, just to add, because we talk a lot about institutional investors. You've heard us mention insurance companies, pension funds, et cetera, and just quickly why they find build to rent such a compelling investment. It's been well proven in the US, again, over decades, that build to rent is a very steady, stable investment class. In good times and bad times, properties generally stay full. Rents may go up or down, depending on the market a bit, but they generally stay full, and very different than, say, investing in office buildings or retail or what have you. And certainly COVID has taught us that office sector is a little more vulnerable, as is retail. But at the end of the day, everyone needs a place to live. So this is the reason why in the US, about 1/3 of all institutional investment into property goes in specifically into multifamily. So it's a huge percentage. And that percentage has grown, since the beginning of my career, where it used to be kind of 5% range. Now it's 30+%, specifically into multifamily. I'm not saying that will get to 33% here in the UK, but it's not inconceivable that it could be 15, 20, 25% of institutional investment in property goes into build to rent. So that's a big increase over time.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with all of that. And of course, we are, in terms of this sector, we are kind of 20 to 30 years, at least behind the States in that. So it's useful to use that as a comparison, because it gives an indication of where those might get to in the future. We can have the next slide, please. And probably the one beyond that, because actually we just wanted to touch on the ESG agenda. So if we can have the next slide, please. The principles of ESG, and I'm sure most people have heard of this and are familiar with it to an extent. It covers not only should we be doing development, but there's environmental, social, and governance aspects of that sort of development which need to be met. And I think the point I really wanted to make here is that build to rent, because it's subject to institutional investment, because it's a deliberately long-term exercise and approach, we have a sort of a natural incentive to do this right. And I think you look at any of the developers and operators in the sector compared to some other property sectors, there is a natural affinity to getting these things right. And perhaps even on, the social is almost the strongest on that, because things are well managed. Most schemes to date, at least, have had an on-site management team which really do look after people, and ensure that a genuine community develops as a result of that development. Can we have the next slide, please? Just to give an example of that. This is sort of evidence from Hamptons very recently. It was actually one of the really tangible ones for residents, obviously with the fuel price crisis and things going on at the moment, is that because build to rent, or largely because build to rent buildings tend to be newer, the average EPC ratings, or the environmental performance of their apartments, is much better. Build to rent is peaking already at category B, whereas the wider PRS sector in the black line there is sort of peaks at C, but there's quite a long tail of D and E and beyond, which need to be upgraded. As I said before, some of those individual landlords are probably coming out of the market rather than face that problem. But what it means for residents is that their annual utility bills are already significantly lower than in other properties, and I suspect that gap is only going to get wider over the coming months. So can we have the next slide, please? So myths and misunderstandings. We move on to the next slide, which I think is probably a poll. If you have a concern about build to rent, what would be your main concern about it as things stand? Because bearing in mind that list we showed before, but and we're going to go through some of those in a bit of detail now. I'm conscious of time, so we're going to keep moving on. If we can have the next slide, please, as well. So some of the common concern are in these categories, and we'll look at each of those very quickly here without touching them on this slide. So the next slide, please. And we've already mentioned this, it's a lifestyle thing. It's obviously, you can be a victim of marketing sometimes, but this sort of rent versus buy lifestyle, and what we hear a lot of is people want to buy, not rent, as we've talked about already. And the reality is most people do rent at some point in their lives, not just when they're younger, but sometimes later in life as well, as their circumstances change. But what they all want is it to be a more reliable experience. So 61%, according to the English Housing Survey, 61% of private renters expect to buy at some point in the future. It doesn't say how long, far away in the future that is. But that still leaves 40% or so who don't think that they will. But there are a lot of barriers to that, and it requires a stable personal circumstances, as I mentioned earlier. But it really comes back to that point: when you need to rent or want to rent, why not do it as well as possible? And that's really what this sector is trying to address.
So James, just want to jump in with results from this last poll. Pretty interesting. So 66%, 2/3, said their main concern was affordability. So there's one we definitely need to hit head on.
Yeah.
I think the point to make is that build to rent is meant for lots of different income brackets. It's not just shiny towers in urban cores. And I think what we are seeing slowly is build to rent in a more of a suburban context, low rise. In the U.S., the term is called multifamily, as I mentioned, or garden style. These often cost less to build, frankly, and therefore the rents can be lower. Affordable with an affordable component as well, which might be have 20 or more percent of the units that are for key worker housing, and they're income based. So there is room for build to rent to tackle affordability. It is obviously depends on the region and the city and the case by case, but I think important for everyone in this session to hear. It's not all meant to be, the tippy top of the market. There's lots of examples of more affordable options in built to rent.
Yeah, and I think that sort of diversification of in every way is something that's coming to the fore. So if we can go to the next slide, please. 10 years ago, we had no evidence about who this was for, and we frequently got asked, who's this product supposed to be aimed at? I slightly flippant answer in a couple of cases, well, people who need homes, and I don't think you'd ask a house builder that question. But actually, I think that question was really based in, legacy and that knowledge and that awareness of bad experiences in the private rented sector, and not wanting any more of those. And quite rightly, neither do we. But now we've got some evidence, and this is a really good report, which I recommend people to have a look at. Who Lives in Build to Rent? The latest edition was published in November, and it really looks at the profile of and the variety of people who are living in Build to Rent. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Some of these are slightly exaggerated quotes, but it's just for posh youngsters. Well, that here's the actual evidence, and you can see the green bars are built to rent, the darker bars are the wider private rented sector, and actually you can see the age range profile on the left there is pretty similar, and there are some variations, but it follows the same shape. Where there's a bit more variation is on the graph on the right, and this is to date. Couples and sharers are actually better or more accommodated in the build to rent. Singles about the same, families not so much to date. But actually, I think evidence is growing that awareness within the families of this type of rental and the security that it brings is growing, and I think the growth of things like single family housing and the more suburban product will help that normalize in the years ahead.
Yeah, I mentioned the property that we're working on in Farnham that's in lease up right now, and it's been very interesting to see just how wide the spectrum has been in terms of the tenants. We have students, young professionals, couples, young families, retirees, empty nesters. I mean, it's really a completely wide range. So it's, again, trying to bust that myth that it's all, 20 and 30 somethings in built to rent. It's much broader than that.
Yeah, and I think that surprised some people actually, even in the build to rent sector, when that started to happen. But let's move on to the next slide, please. And these charts show you the range of professional employment types that people have, and so sometimes you hear it's just for bankers, not key workers. That may be particularly in London, but actually look at the reality there. There's quite a proportion who are in finance or professional jobs, but there's a wide range of jobs. It's not that dissimilar from the wider PRS. And actually, if you look at the public sector there, right in the middle of that chart or in both charts, you can see that pretty much the same level of public sector, which is what we tend to categorize as key workers, although as the last couple of years have shown us, it's key workers is a broader phrase than that covers a whole range of other things. I think the chart on the right just compares London with or the UK as a whole with the regional profile outside London. The next slide, please. I think there's obviously affordability was probably fairly predictably actually the question on that last poll that received the biggest vote, and I think this is a really good myth to bust, because I think you can see here the income profile. Again, the build to rent is in green. You can see the maximum peak is down at between 19 to 32,000. So not huge salaries. And these are household incomes, not individual incomes. So if people are sharing or in couples or families, this is a household income we're talking about here. Clearly both build to rent and private rented sector have people earning at the top end, but actually it's the bottom end that we want to really sort of point out today that is going. And if you look on the chart on the right, in terms of the affordability ratios, but whether it's couples, sharers or families in build to rent compared to the private rented sector more widely, they're all within that third of income.
Well, and build to rent has lots of tools in the toolbox to tackle affordability. There can be a studio apartment offering, which again isn't meant to be long term, but can help someone who's coming up in their career. 2-bedroom units that are very well designed for sharers with a split bedroom profile. Again, generally in the PRS sector, you wouldn't find the kind of the breadth of floor plan designs and sizes of apartments, and that addresses a pretty wide price range.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. We've, as you can tell, we've got lots to talk about on this, but we probably need to just sort of ramp up the pace a bit. So let's go to the next slide, please, which I think we can probably skip over. I'll let people look at that later if they want to, because it's just a comparison of the UK as a whole versus the regions, excluding London. And if we move to the next slide beyond that, please. The company called Home Views is kind of the sort of TripAdvisor of rental housing now, or housing in general, and they've done a really good report for the last few years, growing in evidence base every time. But actually, the reason I put this chart up is that of the various aspects of people's homes, and this is evidence ratings from the residents themselves, the one that's growing fastest at the moment within build to rent is the value for money. So people living in these buildings, experiencing them, are rating value for money higher and higher each year, which I think is a really positive thing, and shows that people are no doubt finding it affordable to them, and better value as a result of the better experience they're getting in return. So let's move on to the next slide, please. One of the things is about concerns is about community and people. Again, it comes from legacy. I think renters only stay 6 months. That doesn't build a community. Well, renters can stay as long as they choose, and that's one of the the key factors from my perspective about build to rent, is that people have that choice to how long they stay. They're in control of when they move in, when they move out. It's a straightforward process, and that gives enormous peace of mind and allows people to build a place in the community, put down roots for as long as it suits them and their circumstances. And in terms of the national picture, renters actually stay on average more than 4 years. So obviously some are shorter than that, but some are clearly much longer than that as well. And that's the sort of thing we want to encourage. Next slide, please. Amenities may be an unfamiliar term, but it's really extra facilities. And one of the myths is people don't really want these; they're too expensive. But actually, the reality is that they are really highly valued by residents, and do help to build that community, because they help people get to know their neighbours and become feel like that's home. The detail of that chart's quite interesting in terms of the lighter bars show that the facilities that are provided by the top 10 in the developments, and the darker bars in the bottom 10. Notice that really expensive things like a swimming pool are not provided by either category of those, and we've heard some other sort of suggestions which are kind of perception things rather than. But what the things that are really valued to people are communal inside spaces. I think is probably the prime one for the last couple of years in pandemic, when increasing numbers of people have been working from home, to have a space in the same building or community where you can go without commuting, that is outside of your own four walls, is a really valuable thing, alongside a gym and concierge and people to look after your interests, and pet friendliness, of course. Some of these things are coming out in the white paper now, which is really good to see. Next slide, please. And if we see that, again, these are ratings from real residents. There's a good correlation between the quality of the facilities that are offered and the ratings that people have on their home. Next slide, please. I've noticed a fair number of comments about affordable housing in the chat, which is really good. It probably takes a separate session on its own to go through this in detail, but in essence, and I've been particularly involved in this for many years. I view build to rent as providing a more continuous mixed community spectrum than the sort of polarized model that we've had to date in this country. It can combine tenure blind communities with that flexibility for individuals as their circumstances change over time. And if we go to the next slide, please. We saw that affordable private rent, defined in NPPF, is an intermediate rent product. It fits very well with build to rent. It means that everyone can have a single entrance into the building, equal access to the facilities within the building, equal specification of their homes, and all being, it's the most tenure blind arrangement you can possibly imagine. And it does allow that sort of future flexibility. So if we go to the next slide as well, please. What that means for individuals and residents living in this sort of intermediate rent product, the NPPF says it can be managed by the same management company, the same landlord, build to rent landlord, and that's really important to criteria that are set in terms of affordability and other aspects within the Section 106. But it means that people can come in, and there may be multiple levels of discount to the rents in those homes, but means that people's situations can either improve or worsen over time. They can stay in the development, they can keep the friends that they've made around them, they can stay part of the community, but either change their tenancy arrangements or their house size, for example, and that makes a really good thing where we actually don't necessarily redline the units, but have an indicative target mix of units to include those affordable homes. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Another concern we have is there'll be that individuals will buy up, and this comes from sale apartments, buy up individual properties, perhaps to let, but perhaps just to keep empty, and that's kind of a waste of producing housing supply. Well, actually, build to rent clearly does not have that. We want to fill buildings up with people. We want to house people more efficiently, and actually, the evidence on the right-hand side there shows that in the private rented sector, that dark line, whereas you've got almost 50% of under occupancy in owner occupation sector, you've got about 15% in the rental sector. And that's there are reasons behind that, which we can maybe address in Q&A if people want to. So
hey, James, I think we're running short on time, so I'm wondering if maybe we should go to one of the case studies as a way to wrap up.
Can we go to
page 71, perhaps?
Slide 66, actually, please. Yeah, we'll. There was a section on design which I'll let you look at in your own time, and we can. Yes, but here we are. We've got three case studies just to wrap up. The first of which is sort of classic build to rent scheme. It's in Salford, Chapel Wharf, and it's rated really high, 4.9 out of 5 by its residents, who have a huge range of positive things to say about it. You can see the internal pictures as well show really nice accommodation, high ceilings. If you go on to the next slide, here's a sort of typical 2-bedroom apartment there. You can see there are 2 pretty equal sized bedrooms, two bathrooms, very suitable for either sharers or families. with a private balcony, and you walk through the entrance door of that apartment, you're straight into a room with the living room with natural light. It's a very appealing sort of layout. That's made possible through installation of sprinklers throughout, and there's good storage as well. So let's move on to the next slide, please. And then here's a sort of cutaway vision of the entrance area, showing the various sort of communal areas that are available to residents when they come into the building. So there are workspaces, there are lounges, there are event spaces where you can either gather or even have a private event in it if you want to. So let's move on to the next one. This is just to highlight the single family homes we were talking about before. Houses for rent rather than apartments is a growing sector across, and it's much more suitable in many parts of the country. Sigma Capital have set up Simple Life to do this in a range of places across the country, and that's growing fast. And that's perhaps more suitable to families and with kids in schools and that sort of thing. But really good for people. And there's obviously a Homes England involvement in that. Go to the next slide, please. And the final case study I wanted to just point out is in Gravesend. It's the Heritage Quarter, and this is something that I think there should be a lot of interest in and a lot more growth in this sort of sector. This is a council-owned land. I think it's a multi-storey car park that is being redeveloped as part of a wider town centre regeneration, and there will be 242 new built-to-rent apartments, a joint venture between the council and the developer. Here, a range of home sizes. Construction is currently underway, but it's the principle of this is that rather than selling off the land for an immediate lump of return, the council is retaining that long-term interest in the land and also an income stream into the future. And I think that's a really sustainable model for local authorities around the country, and it keeps them as a major stakeholder into the future, in their own town centre, in more of a way than if it had just been sold off for sale development.
Yeah, I think what's most interesting to me about this property as a case study is how it's kind of solved so many different issues. It's a regen project, so it's helped regenerate an area of the city. It's provided housing, which is much needed. There's an affordable component as well, and as James said, the council is staying involved in the property longer term, so really creating an annuity for the council long term. So I think just a great solution all the way around.
Yeah, that's great. Can we have the next slide, please? So I think this is the final poll. Having heard all the things we've said over the last hour or so, are you now more in favour of build to rent as a housing type for your area than you were before? I'm optimistic about this one.
And if you say no, we're giving up our speaking tour here.
Yeah, but hopefully we've indicated that the need for it, the context for more deliberately rental housing to be produced, and I guess what we're hoping from this session is that there's a bit more awareness and a bit more understanding when proposals come to you and your organisation. That's great. If we go to the next slide, please.
So the results are in so far, 67%. So James, we've won over 2/3 of the audience. That's pretty good.
Yeah, you have no idea how pleased that makes me.
We'll take that.
Great. But anyway, so some things there's just a list of things we could have talked about in even more detail, but we're happy to come back and do another session on any of these with anyone who wants to. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, I think build to rent is really representing a culture change around renting. It's reflecting active choice and improved experience, and there are real opportunities for local authorities to assist with this. And I hope you understand the reasons why that's a good idea now. Practical policies with build to rent as a recognised tenure, but also the potential for those joint ventures and use of surplus land. And it comes back to my overriding point, my sort of elevator pitch on this, but which is when you need to or want to rent, why not do it as well as possible? So I think that probably concludes what we have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, James. Right, we're going to move on to Q&A. Now, you have provided us with lots of food for thought, and attendees have put in an awful lot of questions. We probably won't be able to answer all of these, but I know that we've had Homes England colleagues in the chat responding to as many as possible. And thank you for suggesting that you could come back and do another session, David and James, just to make sure we answer those questions. So I'd like to start off with a really interesting one that's come in. And you've touched on this, but it'd be good to get almost a sort of rallying cry, if you like, from you. How can the sector change the mindset to renting in a similar way the car industry has done? So I'm presuming, and that's moving to electric cars possibly, but what's the main way, do you think, we can change that mindset?
Well, I think it is a cultural change, as I just mentioned, and you know the thing about culture change is they're really good, but they also take a while for the message. I think build to rent, which I mentioned was a planning term, is not a particularly user-friendly term from a customer-facing point of view. No one's yet come up with a better one, so we're kind of stuck with that. But I think there is an awareness of this type of accommodation now, and people who are living in it and who are having their friends and family come to visit. More and more people are getting, oh, well, actually, there's a better way of doing this than the traditional way. And I think, you know, if you take that car analogy further, I think the environmental benefits are not to be ignored here. I think they're very, very important. And you saw from that graph that these are better quality buildings than people have been able to rent in before, and they're better managed into the future. So they will continue to be more sustainable, and they will continue to try and improve in their operational energy efficiency, for example. So I think that all appeals to current and developing attitudes, and so I think it's raising awareness and people's experience being shared by word of mouth is a really good way of doing that.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I always imagined someone coming and living at a built to rent property and then having their friends over for a dinner party or for drinks or what have you, and many of their other friends maybe being renters and seeing the accommodation, seeing the service and whatnot. And again, doesn't have to be a high-end property. It could kind of mid-range even. It's fine. And having some of their friends say, wow, wait, I'm paying more or less the same amount in rent that you are, and you live in this nice newer property with a gym, maybe with a couple of amenities. So it is a bit of, you tell two friends and they tell two friends and they tell two friends type of thing. The other thing to say is I've mentioned a couple of times this property in Farnham that we're currently leasing up. One of the things we do with new people coming to take a look at the property is we start by saying, well, I don't know if you've heard about what build to rent is, and we give them a little education on how it works, certainty of tenure, professional management, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of on the ground, getting the word out, but it is spreading.
Fantastic. Now, you did talk about the longer term of these properties, and more questions come in which asks, are build to rent conditioned to make sure they stay as rental in perpetuity?
Well, the answer is broadly yes. I mean, I think I think if you talk to anyone in the sector who's developing this, their intention is for it to be rental forever. I think in terms of planning conditions, which is probably what the question is getting at, is typically there's a covenant to say that the buildings have to remain as 100% rental for a period of time. Typically that's 15 years, and if for some reason, and it's probably there have been examples of that some time ago, but if they are ever broken up, there's a clawback mechanism to make sure that the local community doesn't lose out from that. But I think if you talk to anyone who's designing and building these sorts of communities now, there is absolutely zero intention of breaking them up. It would be a very extreme set of circumstances that would lead to that, which we simply don't foresee, and that's because of the demand for rental. And we just want to keep doing that in a really really good way. I mean, the investors here are not looking for an immediate return. They're looking for steady returns to match their pension obligations typically. And that's, it's a very good long-term approach.
Well, these institutional owners that we keep mentioning, generally they're thinking about a 20-year time horizon. So they are really looking at it over the longer term. In the U.S., it does happen occasionally that a multifamily property will be converted into what we call condos, so individual ownership, but it's a bit of an exception. It doesn't happen all that often, and it would typically happen on smaller properties. So when you get into build to rent that are 150 to 250 units, it's probably, I would call it pretty unlikely.
Yeah, I think the other thing to add, that even if the initial investor has a horizon of, say, 20 years, the intention would be even if it was sold at that point, it would be sold to a similar type of investor who would continue that approach into the future beyond that. So that's what I mean, really, in perpetuity. That is the idea.
Brilliant. There are a number of questions that relate to accessibility, access in terms of wheelchair access, but also access to open space. So I just wonder if you could touch on that. What sort of access to open space? I think particularly with COVID in mind and everyone's experience, that's pretty important. And also a question there about the percentage of wheelchair accessible homes that are normally delivered within a scheme. So I wonder if you could touch on both the open space access and wheelchair accessibility as well.
Well, the units, the individual apartments are designed with accessibility in mind. So what you'll see typically is, within bathroom areas, the turning radius for a wheelchair, et cetera. So that's designed in through planning. Because this is all new construction, generally, access is a key part versus older stock. But the other thing that I think is interesting is that many build-to-rent schemes have some type of private outdoor space, whether that's a podium level or a rooftop terrace, or an area where you can go that has complete accessibility, but you're not out of the individual property. So you could go in the evening and walk your dog or feel safe. So that's, I wouldn't say in every case, but in most cases that it has that kind of an amenity space.
Yeah, and just to sort of on the wheelchair units, I think the proportions are the same as any other residential development, and because it's being designed and built to modern standards, that's not a problem to incorporate that. I think the allied to that is most build-to-rent properties, or at least city centre ones, will have significantly reduced car parking from normal or from historic norms because of a lack of demand, and maybe they have a car club or something. But actually, the parking spaces that are available will always be prioritised towards wheelchair users.
Brilliant, thank you. I think this will be the last question. So there's a lot in the chat and also with the responses to the polls around people's concerns regarding affordability. Yeah. And also links to Section 106 contributions for affordable housing. So we've probably had about 3 or 4 questions around getting a better understanding on the Section 106 developer contributions made for build to rent, and whether these are always commuted sum, because a number of people attending have stated that they're often difficult to then use where there's a lack of land. So yeah, be good to know something on that.
Yeah, my personal, I'm disappointed that people are asking for to offer commuted sums in return. I think this type of model works really well for that. I say for that intermediate rent where you can manage the homes and the residents under the same management team in the same way with exactly the same access to all the facilities and community as everyone else. And I think that works brilliantly well. To have that on-site affordable component within the wider mix, and that's as long as that is, I think I think maybe there have been cases where developers have not considered that early enough, and they've ended up with a viability problem which they've tried to resolve in another way. But actually, it really should be built in from the start as to something that, yes, we will include this within our scheme. Yes, of course, there'll be a viability assessment to establish the scope of that. But again, I think the flexibility inherent in that, because you're not having a separate core or building. Generally, you're incorporating everyone in a tenure blind way throughout the development, is that any of the apartments, say if we're talking about apartment buildings, could be market or affordable, or perhaps change in the future as people's individual circumstances change. And I think that's a really healthy model. It's certainly the best I've ever come across in 25 years of being involved in affordable housing delivery.
Yeah, and I would just add, from the US perspective, it's very common to have an affordable component. Could be, again, 10, 20, sometimes as high as 25, 30% at various gradations of affordability. We often refer to it as key worker housing. I think we learned during the pandemic, the term key worker applies to a lot, more people than maybe we originally thought. But to have, as James said, that affordable component, not sectioned off, it's pepper potted throughout the community, same level of service, the apartments are the same. Important though that it is, we think, one management company that's handling the property. When you start to mix an RP, a registered provider, in with the other management company, that can get complicated. So preferably these units are pepper potted, completely tenure blind. And I think that's a really effective way to deliver affordable housing. And I think from a social perspective, that's the right way to design these buildings as well.
And yeah, also to add to that, some of the larger RPs are seriously looking at this as a new type of development that they can get involved with as to manage both the market and the affordable homes there. For many years they've been developing for sale, which is cross-subsidized to their social rent properties. But this is another way of generating those surpluses to be able to do that. And I think that would be a healthy one to explore further.
Fantastic. Okay. Thank you so much. So I'd like to thank James, David and Jennifer, and also our Homes England colleagues who've been in the chat helping to answer many of those questions. And thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.